On July 5th, 1994, Capcom released Darkstalkers: The Night Warriors, the infamous first entry in their sophomore fighting game franchise. With its lightning-fast gameplay, horror aesthetic, and that good old Capcom polish, it became an instant favorite for many among the fighting game community, and a cult classic to this day. Its third and final canonical entry, 1997's Vampire Savior, is one of my personal favorite fighting games as well. Now, this video is not a retrospective. So much ink has been spilled about this series over the years that there's little more value I could add to the conversation about the history of it. Instead, I want to focus on the what if, the potential future. Now, I know the chances of a new Darkstalkers game have historically always been slim. But slim and zero are two very different things, and I'm nothing if not an optimist. Also, with Darkstalkers having turned 30 this year, I think this could be an incredibly timely topic. So without further ado, let's take a look at what I think a new entry into the Darkstalkers series might look like. No, we're not talking about that plot. At least not yet, anyway. One of the silver linings of the indefinite hiatus following the release of Vampire Savior and Vampire Savior 2 is that Capcom had only really begun to scratch the surface of the potential world building that the series afforded. At the end of Vampire Savior, we have a pretty clear-cut happy ending for our primary protagonists. Jeddah, the banished demon lord and would-be usurper of the Makai, is defeated. Morrigan reunites with Lilith and finally reaches her full power and potential, ascending to her rightful place as ruler of the Makai. Felicia quits acting and starts an orphanage/school, and so forth. One protagonist, however, for whom Vampire Savior ends on a less than cheerful note, is Donovan Bane. The stoic Dampier and Dark Hunter's fate was left intentionally ambiguous by Capcom. However, one interpretation does suggest that he is ultimately overcome by his vampire side, becoming the bloodthirsty D. This is the interpretation that will serve as the basis for our story. Darkstalkers 4, which, let's give the working title Darkstalkers Vampire Risen, will be set roughly 10 to 15 years after the events of Vampire Savior. D, having spent the last decade growing his vampiric power, has tired of the existence of being a vampire on Earth, confined to slinking under the cover of night and hunting humans, which he sees as base and animalistic. With Morrigan Ainsland now ruling as the lone lord of the Makai, D has descended upon the demon realm with the aims of inciting a coup, conquering the Makai in the name of vampire kind, and ultimately descending upon Earth and enslaving it. Even with a fully functional moral compass, Donovan was a force to be reckoned with among the most powerful Darkstalkers and Dark Hunters alike, and it's going to take the combined might of many familiar faces, and even a handful of new ones, to save both worlds from his dark designs. This section of the video is most likely going to be the longest one, because we'll be splitting it into 3 parts: returning characters, reimagined characters, and newcomers. I'll be looking at each character individually, talking a bit about their own story within the game, and touching very lightly on their in-game mechanics. Let's start with the undisputed mascot of the series, and almost everyone's favorite succubus, Morrigan Ainsland. This game finds Morrigan not as the carefree succubus she had been in Darkstalkers 1 through 3, but as the ruler of the Makai, who has had some time to really settle into the role. To reflect that, we'll see Morrigan's primary costume get a major overhaul. While her iconic black leotard and purple bat print tights will certainly be an alternate costume, her primary look will more reflect how she looks during Lilith's end screen in Vampire Savior, albeit with some alterations to make the look more functional in combat. Her moveset will remain largely unchanged. She is the Ryu of the series after all. However, Astral Vision will see her not splitting into a reflection of herself, but rather summoning Lilith from within to aid in this attack. As for Morrigan's reason for going after Dee, well, given that he's aiming to take over her kingdom, it's pretty clear she's got some skin in the game. Next up we have the second face of the series, and the FGC's favorite furry-adjacent fighter, Felicia. Felicia herself has had quite the story arc over the course of the first 3 Darkstalkers games. From an orphan girl raised by a nun with her eyes on show business, to a woman, Catwoman, of the cloth herself, giving the future generations of orphans the same loving home that she knew as a child. Like Morrigan, Felicia's new costume will reflect her current place in life, which is not to say that it'll be all that modest. She does still need to fight, so you can expect just enough of the kind of fan service you'd expect from your average fighting game. Still, some minor tweaks here and there will help to denote that Felicia isn't the same carefree young lady she was in earlier games. Much like Morrigan, and indeed much like most of the returning cast, Felicia's moveset will largely be similar to that of the previous games. However, while she will keep her rushdown playstyle, I like the idea of her having some sort of divine healing ability as a super. I mean, in a world populated by literal gods and demons, would the tangible manifestation of the power of prayer really be that far-fetched? And what if Felicia's modus operandi for her involvement? What would make her so compelled to leave everything she'd hitherto built? To leave her young charges? How would she even know about Dee's machinations in the first place? I have an answer, but you're going to need to wait a little later into the video to find out. Speaking of motives, let's turn it over to arguably the most criminally overlooked character in the Darkstalkers franchise, John Talbane. Let's put this out in the open. You know, I know, and Capcom knows that this Kung Fu werewolf tsundere is so down bad for Felicia that he'd nearly give up the British delicacy that is beans on toast for her. So when she up and leaves Felicity House without a word, you know he's not far behind. Something that I feel was underutilized with Talbane, aside from Talbane himself after Vampire Savior, is the non-lunar nature of his lycanthropy. I mean, the guy learned Kung Fu as a human to be able to control his werewolf side, so why not take advantage of that? By this point in his life, we can assume that Talbane can wolf on and wolf off at will. So, by that line of logic, it only seems reasonable to make him a stance character. Will this make him more difficult to play? Absolutely. Do I still think it'll work? Well, I haven't edited this part out at time of recording, so... As for Talbane's look, I think we really want to lean into Capcom's current aesthetic for male legacy fighting game characters, and make our boy thick and rugged. In his lupine form, he'll still be a bit on the lithe side, but with more gray in his fur and a waistline that's not quite so heroin chic as before. Meanwhile, in his human form, we'll see more of a distinguished Kung Fu master aesthetic than Talbane's old feral design, complete with a full beard, because if there's one thing this series could improve upon, it's its waifu to husbando ratio. You didn't think we'd be leaving out all the series' heels, did you? Lord Raptor may well be the most iconic villain character in the entire Darkstalkers franchise, and for good reason. His skeletal appearance is a clear homage to Eddie, mascot for iconic metal pioneers Iron Maiden. His every movement is meant to ooze charisma. And who can forget the incredible performance by early voice acting goat Scott McNeil, who gave the character a swaggering sound that was reminiscent of what would happen if Keith Richards and Angus Young stepped into a fly machine.
Oh, what's the matter, pussycat? I don't do autographs till after the show. Of course, that's assuming you'll still be able to walk after my performance.
If we know two things about Raptor as a character, it's that he's equally power-hungry and conniving. With his benefactor and rival Ozum no longer in the picture as of the end of Vampire Savior, we can very easily surmise that Raptor will have spent the interim between games gradually trying to position himself as a new Lord of the Makai. Now, if we know 3 things about Lord Raptor, we can add that he is often laughably incompetent. So while this whole time he has positioned himself as one of the new Lords of the Makai, and as Morrigan's great rival for control, his claims are largely over-exaggerated, and Morrigan sees Raptor and his zombie hordes as little more than the occasional annoyance, not unlike the Soul Bee population. That is, of course, until D descends upon the Makai, and our silver-tongued rocker slithers his way into an alliance with him, serving as his general. Surprising no one, he also plans to usurp D when the time is right. Now, for Raptor's design in this game, I wanted to really lean into his role as a prominent, if small, dictator in the Makai, while still paying homage to his rockstar roots. So I would love to see a design that takes inspiration from the militaristic stylings of late-era Clash, particularly the Combat Rock album, and their video for Rock the Casbah. Playstyle-wise, Raptor is naturally still a zoner. His moveset from Vampire Savior will remain largely unchanged. Yes, he will still have Hell Dunk. However, a super in which Raptor sicks a mob of underlings on his opponent while he sits back and watches feels very on-brand. At the end of Vampire Savior, this Frankenstein-inspired grappler nobly sacrifices himself, using up all the electricity his body can generate to revive his adoptive sister Emily. Emily, being the first successful experiment of she and Victor's creator Dr. Gurdenheim, has spent years trying to find a way to bring Victor back, as he had done for her. The good news is that it worked. The bad news is it wasn't perfect. Victor's moveset, like most of the characters in this section, is more or less identical to his Vampire Savior moveset, but with a new twist. In this case, his previously electrically charged attacks now lack the same shock, unless they are performed as EX variations. The catch? While the electrically charged attacks will do an absolute boatload of damage, they will also cause Victor's own health bar to deplete. He was reanimated imperfectly after all, and this makes him an especially high-risk, high-reward character. Victor's look will be the least of a departure from his previous design, as he has quite literally been doing nothing in the interim. Some new off-color patches in his clothing, and maybe some new off-color patches in his skin, should more than suffice. Finally, aside from giving grappler players a character in the roster, Victor's reason for being in the game is dependent on us drawing from non-game-specific Darkstalkers lore. In the Udon Comics adaptations of the franchise, Victor had, during the events of said comics, befriended Donovan as they worked together to save Emily and Anita from demon hordes. Emily, having caught Victor up to speed about the world once he reawakens, begrudgingly submits to his pleas to stop D, in the hopes that, somehow, his former friend can return. Our final returning character is a Jiangshi with all the tricks up her sleeves, Xianko. Now, while we know that the end of Vampire Savior sees Xianko and Mei Ling resurrected and living a peaceful life, we also know that this is intrinsically tied to their mother's soul's well-being. In this game, D's rise to power is disrupting the balance between the mortal world and the Makai, resulting in Xianko's mother's soul being trapped in a state of torment, and therein reawakening the twins' powers and memories, discovering that stopping D and returning balance to the two worlds is the only way for their mother and themselves to know rest. For Xianko's design, the idea of traditional meets modern springs to mind. Xianko's outfit could maintain its iconic Chinese-inspired Jiangshi elements, like her talisman, wide-brimmed hat, and long flowing sleeves. However, to give it a fresh look, the costume could be updated with more detailed embroidery and a design more indicative of modern Chinese fashion. The color palette could stay true to her blue and magenta tones, but with slightly darker shades to reflect the darker tone of the game. Xianko's gameplay would retain her tricky, zoning-heavy style, with her ability to throw out various projectiles and extend her limbs for unpredictable attacks. Her heavy reliance on traps and unpredictability would remain central to her playstyle, making her a challenging character for opponents to read. To reflect her increased experience and growth, Xianko could gain a few new tools. She could summon temporary spirit allies that briefly assist her in combat. These spirits might perform minor attacks or shield her from a single hit. Alternately, Xianko could have a new ability that could allow her to briefly turn intangible and phase through attacks or escape tight situations. This would fit her supernatural nature while adding a new layer to her defensive options. The once noble half-vampire Donovan Bane has now fully succumbed to his dark side and taken on the identity of D. No longer torn between his human and vampiric halves, D has embraced his monstrous nature, allowing his full power to manifest. As the game's main villain, D has not only taken Dimitri's place as Morrigan's rival, but also seeks total domination of both the Makai and the human world. For D's design, his appearance would heavily draw upon the inspiration of the D sprites featured in earlier games, which saw Donovan donning Dimitri's devilishly dapper digs. His once gleaming sword could now appear corrupted, radiating a blood-red energy. To emphasize his new identity, subtle demonic features like glowing red eyes and fangs would be more prominent, visually showing the full consumption of his humanity. D's gameplay will blend the best of both Donovan's and Dimitri's abilities, making him a terrifying hybrid fighter. He will retain Donovan's range with his massive sword and magical summons, but will have added Dimitri's close-quarters ferocity and mobility. He could have blood magic, with moves that drain life from his enemies, and new vampiric rushdown techniques that allow him to dominate up close. One standout ability could be a super, known as Bloodlust Frenzy, a rapid series of strikes with his sword, followed by a vampiric bite, leeching the life from his opponent. Our next reimagined character is Bishamon, who, after the events of Vampire Savior, has been freed from the curse of the armor Hanya. Now in his human form, Bishamon fights to ensure no one else suffers the same fate. Though no longer bound to the armor's demonic influence, Bishamon remains a fierce and dedicated warrior, driven by the guilt of his past actions. For Bishamon's design, his human form could retain elements of traditional samurai attire, but with visible signs of his ordeal. He could wear his simple, battle-worn kimono, perhaps with fragments of Hanya's armor integrated into his new outfit, as a reminder of the past. His face might carry scars from his battles, and his eyes could have a haunted yet determined expression. His weapon of choice could remain a katana, but with a more purified appearance, perhaps glowing faintly to reflect his now sacred nature. Bishamon's gameplay would see a significant shift. Without the demonic power of Hanya, Bishamon now fights as a highly technical character, relying on precise and disciplined swordplay and defensive techniques. His gameplay would focus on counter-based mechanics, punishing opponents who would leave themselves open. While less aggressive than his previous incarnation, his speed and focus on quick, lethal strikes would still make him a formidable threat. New moves could include a parry stance, where he absorbs blows and retaliates with devastating counterattacks, and a purification slash, where a single charged strike could dispel magical projectiles. The relentless hunter of souls and queen of the soul bees, QB, returns to Vampire Risen with a more sinister agenda. Over the years, QB has grown in power, with her hive expanding and evolving, becoming more aggressive as a result of the imbalance D has wrought within the Makai. QB's primary goal remains survival, and she views humanity as both prey and resource, aligning with D's quest to enslave the human race. For QB's design, her insectoid appearance could be enhanced to reflect her evolution over the years. Her wings might be larger and more segmented, while her body could have additional armor-like chitin plates. Her once cute, almost playful demeanor could now be replaced with a more menacing, predatory look, with sharper features and more insectoid eyes. QB's gameplay would still revolve around her fast aerial attacks and pressure-based style, but with enhanced abilities that make her even more dangerous in swarms. She could summon hive drones that attack in unison with her, applying overwhelming pressure on her opponent. Additionally, a new Hive Queen mode could briefly boost her attack power, speed, and regeneration, making her nearly unstoppable in short bursts. This ability would drain her meter, but allow for deadly offensive maneuvers. The ever-sinister mercenary BB Hood returns, more ruthless and more cunning than ever. Years of hunting dark creatures have made her even more dangerous. She sees Dee's rise as another lucrative opportunity, and has no qualms about working both sides of the conflict if it benefits her. For BB Hood's design, her iconic red hood and girlish outfit would be replaced with an outfit more befitting of her role as an even more seasoned, deadlier Dark Hunter. Her outfit could appear more worn and tactical, with hidden weapons cleverly concealed throughout. She might now carry a more advanced arsenal, including modernized versions of her missile launchers, machine guns, and mines, showing her evolution into a more high-tech mercenary. Aesthetically, BB's outfit would lean more heavily into the look of the Huntsman rather than Red Riding Hood, adorned with trophies taken from her kills, with a wolf pelt replacing her iconic red cloak as the outfit's focal point. BB Hood's gameplay would still center around her deceptive, zoning-heavy playstyle, using her hidden weapons to overwhelm opponents from a distance. However, in keeping with the passage of time, she could also have more trap-based abilities, such as laying explosive mines that detonate when an opponent approaches, or a new sniping ability, where she takes a moment to charge a long-range, high-damage shot. Additionally, she could use drones or other automated gadgets to hunt down her opponents, making her even more of a menace when played defensively. As with a new iteration of so many great fighting game franchises, Vampire Risen will feature a new generation of fighters, with two in particular meant to symbolize a passing of the torch. Where our previous iterations put Morrigan and Dimitri at the forefront of the story, we now turn to Anita, psychic powerhouse and once ward of Donovan Bane, and Harry Grimoire, the kid from the Darkstalkers cartoon?
Ow! You're hurting my arms!
Just hear me out here. Much in the same way that Scott McNeil took the mediocre pile of wet clay he was given with that show and molded it into the definitive English voice of a character, there are nuggets within the concept of Harry that I think can be molded into something really cool, and in line with both this hypothetical game and the series as a whole. For instance, what if, rather than Harry being a boilerplate self-insert character who hangs out with Felicia because reasons, I guess, we imagine him as a former resident of Felicity House. A long-lost descendant of druids, Harry is contacted by the spirits of his forebears, roused by the disruption wrought as Dee peels away the barrier between Earth and the Makai. Thus, imbued with long-dormant arcane powers and granted the task to protect the mortal realm, Harry begins his mission to track down and destroy Dee. Harry's design will see him keeping the blonde hair and glasses, as well as some sort of magic tome, but that is largely where the aesthetic influence from his initial Saturday morning design will begin and end. With adult Harry, we'll see more of an influence from DC Comics' John Constantine, or Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden, sporting a long trench coat or duster jacket. Druidic tattoos will adorn Harry's forearms, and yet despite his clear power, Harry carries himself with all the mannerisms of the reluctant hero that he is. As one of the protagonists of Vampire Risen, Harry would be built as a balanced Shoto character, conjuring bolts of energy for his projectiles, an arcane pillar for his DP, and being encircled by a maelstrom of pages from his tome as a Tatsu. His standard attacks would be rooted in Western pugilistic style, akin to Terry Bogard from King of Fighters, with influences of traditional kung fu, a callback to the Udon Comics canon in which John Talbane is seen after the events of Vampire Savior, teaching kung fu to the children of Felicity House. The yin to Harry's yang, Anita is all too well of the calamity that Dee is capable of, and intent on bringing about. However, in much the same way as Donovan refused to give up on her as a child, she refuses to give up on him as a monster. Anita believes wholeheartedly that Dee can be redeemed once more, and while she and Harry both aim to put an end to the Dampiers' plans, their methods will put them at odds with one another on more than one occasion. For her design, we see Anita very clearly drawing inspiration from the Donovan Bane she knew, complete with Buddhist robes, prayer beads that she imbues with her psychic energy to become a powerful weapon, and a long, braided ponytail. As with Harry, Anita will be designed with a Shoto moveset, incorporating a mix of psionic attacks and Shaolin Kung Fu. A psychic projectile, a bead whip anti-air as a DP, and a good old-fashioned lateral kick as a Tatsu will act as Anita's big three specials. Thanks to a brand new lifetime spent being able to coexist as individuals, Xianko's formerly inseparable fraternal twin Mei Ling is now very much separable. So much so that she would be a fully realized playable character in Vampire Risen. Similar to Capcom's mainline fighting game twins Yun and Yang, Xianko and Mei Ling will be united in a cause, but with their own distinct personalities and playstyles that make them more than a simple palette swap of one another. Much like her sister, Mei Ling's design will be a more modernized take on her look in earlier Darkstalkers games, combining elements of her traditional Taoist priestess garb with contemporary Chinese streetwear. Also like her sister, Mei Ling would be a zoner. While Xianko retains the dual nature of her original playstyle, however, Mei Ling would embody a more focused, spiritual combat, perhaps with quick, precise attacks and healing abilities. Mei Ling could serve as a support-style character with her own distinct moveset, but without the heavy reliance on traps, instead focusing on purifying attacks that nullify projectiles and defensive maneuvers that set her apart from her sister. Now, if you're anything like me, one question you may have asked about Darkstalkers is why didn't they ever include a witch character? This series is all about campy supernatural horror, and witches are, well, peak that. In Vampire Risen, this would be rectified. Brainstorming a witch that was more than just the Wicked Witch of the West but Capcom hot took me a little bit of time. There's a lot of very cool witchy folklore from all over the world, after all. Ultimately, however, I settled on the idea of putting a Darkstalkers spin on the iconic Slavic legend of Baba Yaga. Within the Darkstalkers universe, it stands to reason that witches would exist in covens, and perhaps as a larger overall collective. Much as QB is the leader of the Soul Bees in the Makai, Vampire Risen's witch character, whom I've named Lady Yaga, would be the current matron of the global Greater Coven of Witches. Witches could act as secret arbiters between Darkstalkers and humans, helping to keep the peace between the two under the veil of darkness. Dee's rise to prominence in the Makai and subsequent invasion of the mortal world could be seen as a war crime of the highest order by the witches, so dire that they must rely on the matron to lead the charge in driving the hordes of the Makai back from whence they came, and force Dee to answer for his crimes. For her design, Lady Yaga blends elements of Eastern European folklore with influences from modern Gothic and pagan aesthetics. Her youthful face would be framed by long, flowing silver hair pouring out from a patterned babushka, a look that purposefully makes her age ambiguous. She would wield a gnarled staff adorned with mystical runes and small, eerie charms. Her accessories, like a bone necklace and feather cloak, further tie her to the Forest Witch theme. As a footsie character, Yaga's moveset would be focused on controlling the neutral, pokes that rely on her staff, as well as the conjuration of bones from the ground and a flaming skull projectile, would make up the bulk of her normals and special moves, as well as a super that would involve Yaga trapping her opponent in her cauldron and dealing massive amounts of damage. With the clear inspiration that the Darkstalkers franchise has drawn from the Universal monsters, it seems only fitting to draw equal inspiration from other characters within that canon, or rather the source material thereof. With only 2 playable Dark Hunters in the entirety of the franchise up to this point, I see no reason not to add a 3rd to Vampire Risen. And who better to draw inspiration from than the OG Vampire Hunter himself? No, not Buffy. Not Simon either, or any of the Belmonts for that matter. Konami tried to claim they invented genetics for a lawsuit. You think they'd let that fly? No, I'm talking about the first man to go toe-to-toe with Dracula. Abraham Van Helsing. Now, for the sake of obfuscation, I think just Abraham will do for our Vampire Hunter, but the story remains pretty similar. A professor of parabiology, Abraham has sworn an oath to rid the world of the scourge of vampires at all costs. As these denizens begin to invade the mortal world from the Makai, Abraham is contracted by the Dark Hunters to use his expertise and drive back the threat, a mission he accepts with aplomb. Abraham's design will lean heavily into the rule of cool, with a steampunk aesthetic that almost goes full Guilty Gear. Clad in a mix of rugged, weathered leather and polished brass, Abraham's appearance is a perfect fusion of Victorian style and industrial innovation. He wears a long tailored coat with reinforced metallic plating on its shoulders and forearms, designed to withstand supernatural blows. His outfit is completed by a wide-brimmed hat, protective goggles, and a bandolier lined with vials of holy water and arcane elixirs. His primary weapon is a modified rapid-fire crossbow, alongside a retractable stake attached to a spring-loaded gauntlet. In terms of playstyle, Abraham is a rushdown character through and through. His moveset would revolve around rapid dashes, quick strikes with his mechanical stake, and short-range projectiles from his steam-powered crossbow. One of his signature abilities could be Vampire Bane, a close-range multi-hit combo that ends with a powerful stake thrust, dealing extra damage to supernatural foes. He also has access to Steam Burst, where he uses pressurized steam to propel himself across the stage, dodging attacks or initiating surprise combos. Now, I want you all to bear in mind that I am not a game designer by any stretch of the imagination, so don't expect this section to be a hyper-detailed overview of the mechanics. Rather, this section is simply going to lay out what I feel would be the different playable game modes in Vampire Risen. First and foremost, the game will have your standard arcade mode, local and online versus mode, and a practice mode that allows you to lab against a CPU dummy, complete combo challenges, and maybe play through bonus minigames that help practice fundamentals. Arcade mode would function like you might expect, a 10-match gauntlet of mostly randomly selected CPU opponents, but with specific opponents for the 5th and 10th matches to offer some plot progression for the character. Versus mode would also be about what you would expect. Single one-off matches between the first player and either second player or CPU when offline, or ranked or casual matches against another player when online. And because I know this is a complete pie-in-the-sky pipe dream video, maybe the game could feature an intuitive online lobby system? Just saying. To that end, it would be interesting to see some multiplayer integration with these practice modes, like a minigame score challenge, or a back-and-forth combo challenge with rules similar to a game of Skate or Horse. One of my favorite trends with modern fighting games has to be the take on story modes, especially Tekken 8, Street Fighter V, and Grand Blue Fantasy vs. Rising. As such, I would love to see a similar design for Vampire Risen's story mode. The majority of the playthrough would focus on either Anita or Harry as they undertake their separate quests to put an end to Dee's machinations. Along the way, both will come across various other characters in the roster, either as opponents or allies, including one another. There will also be various points within the story where the player will take control of the other members of the roster. This not only allows for a chance for the player to experience multiple playstyles, but it also tells the story in a more holistic way. There could even be branching paths that expand on certain characters' individual stories as you play, allowing for even more dynamism and even more replayability. Finally, I think it's high time that Capcom brought back what I feel was a criminally underutilized game mode from their fighting game archives: two-player co-op. Street Fighter Alpha 3's co-op mode felt like such an innovative idea the first time I played it. In a genre that, by definition, pits you against anyone you wish to play with, the idea of co-op was a breath of fresh air. As such, Vampire Risen's story mode could also feature a two-player option, in which each of the fights would have player 1 controlling the main playable character, while player 2 would control a second character in the roster. Arcade mode would also feature a co-op that would function more or less identically to solo arcade mode, albeit with a slightly higher difficulty to account for the added player. And that about covers it for what I think a new Darkstalkers game would look like. Thank you all so much for sticking through to the end of this video. It's definitely the most intensive one I've worked on so far for this channel, but this series is one I feel really passionate about, and it was fun working on this. I know there are characters and ideas that I didn't discuss, maybe some of your favorites, and if there's interest, I could always make a part 2 that discusses what future seasons of DLC might look like for Vampire Risen. So let me know in the comments who or what you'd like to see in a new Darkstalkers. Also, be sure to like this video, and if you enjoy fighting game content, maybe subscribe to the channel and take a look at some of my other videos. Until next time, this is Uncle Boneless reminding you that fighting games are for everybody. And please, please Capcom, give us another Darkstalkers. Please? An extra special thanks to the concept artists for this video, KillurMonkey and Deus Marionette, as well as Deus Marionette for all of her incredibly hard work helping to edit this to make sure it got out on time. Their links are going to be down in the description.